The Christmas lights were still blinking. Red, gold, white, red, gold, white. They blinked in a steady, cheerful rhythm, completely indifferent to the woman standing in the doorway of her own home, barefoot on the cold marble floor, one hand pressed flat against the doorframe, and the other pressed flat against the enormous curve of her belly. She was 8 months pregnant. 8 months. The kind of pregnant where strangers offer you their seat on the subway. The kind where your ankles ache before noon, and your back never fully stops hurting, and every night you fall asleep talking quietly to the person you haven't yet met, the small, miraculous, impossible person growing inside you. She was that kind of pregnant, and her husband was standing in the foyer of their $5 million home on Christmas Eve with a woman she had never seen before, wearing her husband's button-down shirt, the pale blue one she had ironed herself just 3 days ago, and neither of them looked surprised to be caught. That was the part that broke her. Not the shirt, not the woman, not even the Christmas lights, still blinking cheerfully in the background like nothing in the world had gone wrong. It was the fact that he wasn't surprised. He looked at his pregnant wife standing in the doorway, and his expression did not flicker. His jaw did not drop. There was no shame in his eyes, no flash of guilt, no desperate scramble for an explanation. There was only something cold and almost impatient, like a man who had rehearsed this moment and found it somewhat tiresome. "Eleanor," he said, just her name, like a period at the end of a sentence that had already been decided. And in the silence that followed, she understood everything. But what he didn't know in that moment, what he couldn't possibly have imagined as he stood there with his borrowed indifference and his casual cruelty, was that the woman gripping the doorframe was not as powerless as she looked, not even close. To understand what happened on that Christmas Eve, you have to go back 7 years. 7 years to a woman named Eleanor Voss, 26 years old, brilliant, quietly stubborn, and deeply, dangerously in love with a man who was still becoming who he thought he wanted to be. Eleanor had grown up in a small town in Vermont, the kind of town where everyone knows your name and your grandmother's name and the name of the dog you had when you were 9. Her father had been a high school math teacher. Her mother had run a small alterations shop out of the back of their home, taking in hemlines and wedding gowns and the occasional prom dress for 30 years without ever once complaining about the work. Eleanor had inherited her father's mind and her mother's hands, meaning she could solve problems quickly and precisely, and she was never afraid to work, not afraid to stay late, not afraid to start over, not afraid to do the thing that nobody else wanted to do, quietly, without asking for credit. She had graduated top of her class from a small but respected university in Boston, a degree in finance, minor in business law, and had been offered a position at a prestigious investment firm in Manhattan before she had even finished packing her graduation boxes. She was 23 when she started. She was 24 when she met Daniel Ashworth. Daniel was everything that Eleanor's small-town childhood had never prepared her for. He was tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of handsome that photographed well and photographed often. He came from a family with money, old money, the kind that had been accumulating quietly in the background of American commerce for 3 generations, and he wore that money the way some men wear expensive watches, not to show off exactly, but because it was simply part of how he moved through the world. He was also, in those early days, genuinely charming. He had a way of making Eleanor feel like the most interesting person in any room. He would ask her questions and actually listen to the answers. He remembered the small things, her coffee order, the name of her mother's dog, the fact that she always got cold in air-conditioned restaurants and needed a cardigan. He sent flowers on random Tuesdays for no reason except that he had seen them and thought of her. And Eleanor, who had spent her entire life being capable rather than celebrated, being the smart one rather than the chosen one, fell completely, helplessly in love with the feeling of being seen. Their first date was in October. They were engaged by the following spring. Her mother had cried happy tears at the engagement dinner. Her father had shaken Daniel's hand for a long time, looking at him carefully with those quiet teacher's eyes, and had said, "You take care of her." Daniel had smiled and said, "Always." Eleanor had believed him. The early years of their marriage were genuinely good, or at least they contained enough genuine warmth that the cold patches felt like weather rather than climate. Daniel's family business, Ashworth Capital, a mid-sized private equity firm, had been struggling quietly when they married. His father had stepped back from management due to declining health, and Daniel had inherited the reins of a company that was losing momentum. Several key clients had departed. One major acquisition had gone badly wrong. The board was restless. It was Eleanor who stabilized it, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that anyone would have noticed from the outside, but quietly, methodically, the way she did everything. She began auditing the firm's internal structure in her spare time. She reorganized their risk assessment model. She identified 3 undervalued mid-market companies that Ashworth Capital could acquire at favorable terms, and she presented the analysis to Daniel on their kitchen table one Sunday morning over coffee, in a binder she had prepared herself. Daniel had looked at the binder, then at his wife, and said, "When did you do all this?" "Evenings and some mornings," she said. He had stared at her for a moment with something that looked almost like wonder. Then he had taken the binder to his office, and over the next 18 months, implemented every single recommendation in it. 2 of the 3 acquisitions became transformative for the firm. Within 3 years, Ashworth Capital had doubled in revenue. Daniel told the story at board dinners sometimes. "My wife gave me the roadmap," and everyone would laugh and look warmly at Eleanor, and she would smile. And she never once mentioned that she had also done the analysis, run the numbers, identified the targets, and written the entire strategic framework on evenings and weekends, while also holding down her own full-time position at the investment firm. She had simply been happy that it worked. She had loved him. That was the truth of it. She had loved him clearly, practically, and without reservation, the way her mother loved her father, the way people from small towns in Vermont learn to love, steadily and for keeps. But there were signs. There always are, in retrospect. There was the way Daniel began changing once the money stabilized, the subtle shift from gratitude to entitlement, the way he stopped asking questions and started issuing opinions, the way he began introducing himself at events as the man who turned Ashworth Capital around, without the asterisk, without the footnote, without ever once mentioning the Sunday morning and the binder and the wife who had worked through evenings and weekends, while also holding down her own full-time position. There was the way his mother, Margaret Ashworth, a formidable, elegant woman with iron opinions and a socialite's precision, began treating Eleanor with a particular brand of polite dismissiveness. Not rudely, never rudely, just the small subtractions, the party invitations that arrived slightly too late for Eleanor to attend, the family photos in which Eleanor was always somehow at the edge of the frame, the offhand comments at holiday dinners about Daniel's success, as though success were a thing a man produced alone in isolation from nothing. There was the way Daniel, when they argued, and they began arguing more frequently in their 5th year, the way long-married couples argue with old vocabulary and familiar wounds, would say things like, "I built this life for us." "Built," he would say, as though Eleanor had been the architect's assistant, handing up tools. She let it go, because she loved him, because she was generous, because she was perhaps too accustomed to doing the work without needing the credit. And then she got pregnant. The pregnancy had been planned, or rather hoped for. They had been trying for almost 2 years, quietly and without much discussion, and when the test finally showed 2 lines on a Tuesday morning in April, Eleanor had sat on the edge of the bathtub and wept with a joy so enormous it had no sound. Daniel had been pleased. He had kissed her forehead and told his colleagues the news with the pride of a man announcing a personal accomplishment. He attended the first ultrasound and stood looking at the blurry gray screen with an expression Eleanor had interpreted as awe. But as her pregnancy progressed, Daniel had progressively, quietly, like a tide going out, receded. More late nights at the office, more weekend business trips, more dinners where he came home after she was already asleep and left before she woke. His phone, once left casually on countertops and charging pads, was now always face down, always silenced, always within his personal reach. Eleanor noticed. Of course she noticed. She was a woman who had reorganized an entire private equity firm in her spare time. She was not unobservant. But she was also 8 months pregnant and exhausted and deeply, profoundly hoping she was wrong. She was not wrong. She had come home early that Christmas Eve because her back had been... "A year," she said. "I know this isn't a year. Eleanor, I'm 8 months pregnant, Daniel." The words landed in the room like stones into water. She watched his face. She was looking for something, remorse, perhaps, or the flicker of the man she had married, the man who had listened and remembered and sent flowers on random Tuesdays. But what she found instead was a kind of resigned composure, the face of someone delivering news they consider unfortunate but necessary. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry for the timing. I was going to wait until after the baby, but..." "You were going to wait? Eleanor, please don't..." "You were going to wait?" Her voice did not rise. It dropped, lower and lower, the way a temperature drops before a storm. "What exactly were you going to wait for? My recovery? Were you timing it out?" He said nothing. Simone took 2 quiet steps toward the hallway. "Don't," Eleanor said, without looking at her. "Don't you dare make yourself invisible right now. You stand right there." Simone stopped. What happened next would later be told in different versions by different people, in the way that traumatic moments always splinter into competing narratives, depending on who is standing where. But what actually happened, what Eleanor would remember with a clarity that never faded, was this. Daniel walked to the side table in the foyer and picked up a manila envelope that had been sitting there, face down as though waiting. He held it out to her. His expression was neither cruel nor kind. It was simply finished, the way a door looks when it has been closed from the other side. "My attorney had these drawn up last week," he said. "Divorce papers. I'd like to keep the process civil. You'll be well taken care of. The attorneys have structured a fair settlement." Eleanor looked at the envelope. She did not take it. "A fair settlement," she repeated. "The house in Connecticut can be yours. Full custody arrangement is negotiable. The financials are generous, Eleanor. You won't struggle." "The house in Connecticut," she said slowly. "The house my mother helped me decorate. The house you've been to 4 times in 6 years. Eleanor, and this house that I designed, that I chose every fixture and tile in, the house where our daughter is going to be born?" Daniel looked at the floor briefly, then back up. "That house is in the Ashworth Family Trust. You know that." "I know exactly what I know, Daniel." She looked at him for a long moment. Her hand was still on her belly. She could feel the baby moving, small, definitive movements, as though the child inside her was equally paying attention. "I'm not signing anything tonight, and I'm not leaving my home on Christmas Eve." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in Daniel's expression, the finished door reopening just a fraction, not with warmth, but with strategy. "I had hoped we could be adult about this. I am being extraordinarily adult. Eleanor, Simone and I said I'm not leaving tonight." She went upstairs. She packed a bag, a small one, only what she needed, because she was not, in spite of everything she had said, willing to spend another hour under the same roof as those 2 wine glasses sitting on her coffee table beside her Christmas tree. She packed slowly and deliberately, moving through her own closet with the strange dissociation of a person in mild shock, choosing things with the automatic precision of a woman accustomed to making decisions under pressure. Her phone buzzed, a text from Daniel. I'll have the rest of your things moved to Connecticut by January 3rd. Eleanor read the message. She put the phone in her coat pocket, picked up her bag, and walked down the stairs and out the front door of her home without another word to either of them. Behind her, through the closed door, she could hear the soft murmur of voices resuming, and then, faintly, the sound of a Christmas song beginning to play from somewhere inside. She stood in the cold driveway, 8 months pregnant on Christmas Eve, in the blue dark silence of a winter night, and she breathed. In, out, in, out. And then she got into the car she had called, and she left. The next morning, the Ashworth family Christmas brunch proceeded as planned. Eleanor had not, of course, been invited to know that it would proceed as planned. She had been at her friend Diane's guest room, having arrived the previous night with her small bag and her large belly, and a composure that had frightened Diane more than tears would have. But Margaret, Daniel's mother, had organized the family brunch herself. 30 guests, a caterer, a centerpiece arrangement of white lilies and red berries, and at some point between the smoked salmon and the champagne toast, Margaret had stood at the head of the table and said with the gracious efficiency of a woman delivering moderately inconvenient weather news, "I think most of you are aware that Daniel and Eleanor are going through some changes. I hope we can all extend our support to Daniel during this transition, and of course, wish them both well." She sat down. Someone started clinking their champagne glass, and Simone, seated at the table, in the chair that had always been Eleanor's, had smiled. Eleanor heard all of this 3 days later from Daniel's cousin Rachel, who called her with the barely contained urgency of a woman who had witnessed something indecent and needed someone to know. Rachel had always liked Eleanor. Rachel, at 17, watched her own parents go through something similar. Eleanor listened to the entire account without interrupting. When Rachel finished, she said, "Thank you for telling me." "Eleanor, are you okay?" A pause. "I will be, thank you, Rachel." She hung up the phone and sat for a moment in Diane's guest room, her hands folded over her belly, and she thought with the quiet precision of a woman who had once rebuilt a company in her spare time about what she knew, what he did not. Eleanor had nodded and smiled and asked the appropriate questions and thanked the doctor and walked out through the hospital lobby past the New Year's Eve flowers someone had placed at the reception desk, yellow chrysanthemums, cheerful and defiant against the gray day outside, and out to the parking structure, and she had sat down behind the wheel of her rented car, and she had not turned the engine on. She sat there for a long time. The rain drummed softly on the concrete overhead. Other cars passed behind her. Somewhere in the distance, a hospital intercom announced something in a measured, clinical voice. Eleanor placed both palms flat against her belly. She thought about her mother, who had made alterations in the back of their house for 30 years and never once complained, who had looked at Daniel Ashworth at that engagement dinner with something that might have been hope or might have been prayer, who had died 18 months ago, a stroke, sudden in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, and who was therefore not available to receive the phone call that Eleanor most desperately wanted to make right now. Mom, she thought, not out loud, inwardly, the way you address someone who is no longer reachable. What do I do? The answer came not in words, but in sensation. The small, definitive kick against her palm that she had been feeling for 2 months now, the punctuation of a small life insisting on its own presence. "Here I am," the baby seemed to say. "Don't you dare let go." Eleanor pressed her hands more firmly against her belly. She thought about what she was, not who she had been to Daniel, not the function she had served in his story, the capable wife, the silent architect, the woman behind the numbers. She thought about what she actually was. She was Eleanor Voss. She had graduated top of her finance class. She had rebuilt a failing company from her kitchen table. She had spent the last 7 years pouring her intelligence and her labor and her love into a life that someone else was now treating as a house they had decided to sell. She thought about the document she had signed 6 weeks before her wedding, the prenuptial agreement that Daniel's family attorney had presented with an apologetic smile and a speech about standard Ashworth family practice. She thought about the version of that document she had read in 2 hours while Daniel was at his bachelor party. The version she had annotated in red ink. The version she had brought to her own attorney the following morning. Her own attorney who had said, "Eleanor, did you read the full addendum on page 47? And Eleanor had said, "Yes." And her attorney had looked at her for a long moment and said, "Does Daniel know you read this?" And Eleanor had said quietly, "No." She had not thought about that conversation in years. She thought about it now. What he doesn't know, she thought, is going to matter. She started the engine. The windshield wipers began their patient, rhythmic work. Eleanor pulled out of the parking structure and drove, slowly and carefully, into the gray New Year's rain. The following weeks were the hardest and the longest of her life. The divorce papers sat on the table at Diane's apartment in their manila envelope, untouched. Daniel's attorney called twice, politely but with increasing firmness, inquiring about the timeline. Eleanor's own attorney, a woman named Charlotte Park, whom Eleanor had engaged within 48 hours of leaving the house, recommended by a colleague and confirmed by 3 independent reviews as one of the most precise family law practitioners in the city, had told Daniel's legal team calmly and in writing that Mrs. Ashworth would respond in her own time. The press found out in the second week of January. Someone, Eleanor suspected Margaret or someone in Margaret's circle, had placed a carefully managed item in one of the city's gossip columns. Daniel Ashworth of Ashworth Capital and his wife are separating. Sources close to the family indicate the separation is amicable. Amicable. Eleanor had read the word in the column while eating breakfast and placed the newspaper very deliberately face down on the table. Her friend, Diane, who had been watching from the kitchen doorway, said, "Eleanor, I'm fine. You don't have to be fine. I know." A pause. "I'm fine anyway." She was not entirely fine. There were nights, the small dark hours between 2 and 4 a.m., when the baby's movements woke her, and she lay in the unfamiliar guest room looking at the ceiling and felt the full, enormous weight of what had happened. Not just the betrayal itself, but the architecture of it, the year of planned deception, the Christmas Eve timing, the brunch that had proceeded as scheduled with another woman in her seat, the amicable in the newspaper. The loss of the man she had thought she knew. The grief of that underneath everything else. She let herself feel it. In the 2 to 4 a.m. hours, she let herself feel it completely, the anger and the sorrow and the specific bone-deep exhaustion of loving someone who had been slowly, quietly preparing to leave you while you were carrying their child. And then, at 4 a.m., she would get up. She would make herself a cup of chamomile tea. She would sit at the kitchen table with her legal pad and her notes and her laptop, and she would work. Because Eleanor Voss had never in her life confused feeling something with being stopped by it, and because there was something coming, something that she had been thinking about carefully and precisely and with the full force of everything she knew. The divorce hearing was scheduled on the 14th of March, Valentine's Day month, not by coincidence, Eleanor thought. Daniel's attorney had a flair for the theatrical. Daniel's legal team had filed for a straightforward dissolution of marriage, division of assets per the prenuptial agreement, joint custody of the child pending birth, and a financial settlement that was, by most objective measures, quite generous. A substantial annual sum, the Connecticut house, medical expenses fully covered, college fund established for the baby. It was a clean, well-packaged ending, the kind of ending that men with money and good attorneys are able to construct when they want to appear reasonable. Daniel's attorney, a senior partner named Gerald Ho, had told Charlotte Park directly during the preliminary call, "Mrs. Ashworth should understand that our client is being extraordinarily fair. We hope she'll engage constructively." Charlotte had written 3 words in her notepad during that call. "He doesn't know." She had underlined it. Because here is what none of them, not Daniel, not Gerald Ho, not Margaret Ashworth sipping tea in her townhouse and thinking the matter settled, not Simone, who was apparently already being photographed at charity events on Daniel's arm, knew. 7 years ago, 6 weeks before her wedding, Eleanor Voss had read page 47 of her prenuptial agreement. Page 47 contained an addendum, a very specific addendum, added at the insistence of Eleanor's attorney at the time, a clause that had been buried in the document with the kind of practiced subtlety that suggests someone hoped it would not be noticed, which became, under careful reading, the most important paragraph in the entire contract. And 5 years ago, while Daniel had been busy presenting himself as the architect of Ashworth Capital's recovery, Eleanor had done something else, something quiet and precise and with the full force of everything she knew. She had structured a holding company in her maiden name. She had taken the personal income from her consulting work, which Daniel had always treated as pocket money, an amusing hobby, my wife's little projects, and she had built something with it, carefully, legally, with the help of a financial architect she trusted and a corporate attorney who understood discretion. She had built something that Daniel Ashworth, in all his confidence, in all his certainty, had never thought to look for. Because he never thought to look. Because he never thought she was that kind of woman. He knew she was capable. He used her capability freely and attributed it to himself without guilt. But he never, not once, not for a single considered moment, imagined that she was the kind of woman who planned for the possibility of exactly this. But what he didn't know, she thought, is going to matter. She started the engine. The windshield wipers began their patient, rhythmic work. Eleanor pulled out of the parking structure and drove slowly and carefully into the gray New Year's rain. The following weeks were the hardest and the longest of her life. The divorce papers sat on the table at Diane's apartment in their manila envelope, untouched. Daniel's attorney called twice, politely but with increasing firmness, inquiring about the timeline. Eleanor's own attorney, a woman named Charlotte Park, whom Eleanor had engaged within 48 hours of leaving the house, recommended by a colleague and confirmed by 3 independent reviews as one of the most precise family law practitioners in the city, had told Daniel's legal team calmly and in writing that Mrs. Ashworth would respond in her own time. The press found out in the 2nd week of January. Someone, Eleanor suspected Margaret or someone in Margaret's circle, had placed a carefully managed item in one of the city's gossip columns. Daniel Ashworth of Ashworth Capital and his wife are separating. Eleanor had been building Voss Financial Partners slowly and deliberately for 5 years, funding it from her consulting income and from 3 very precisely chosen private investments that she had made with the detached expertise of a woman who had spent her career identifying undervalued opportunities. One of those investments had been in a technology company that had, 14 months ago, been acquired by a larger firm for a number that made headlines in the financial press. Eleanor's stake, held under Voss Financial Partners, under her maiden name, in a structure that was entirely legal and entirely separate from any Ashworth asset, had returned more than 30 times its original value, which meant that Eleanor Voss, the woman Daniel Ashworth had offered a Connecticut house and a generous annual sum as consolation for 7 years, was, on paper, worth considerably more than her husband. More, in fact, than Ashworth Capital itself. But that was only the first layer. The second layer was page 47. The prenuptial agreement addendum that Daniel's attorney had buried and that Eleanor had read annotated and discussed with her attorney before signing, contained a clause that, in the language of contract law, created what is known as a reversion right. In plain terms, if the party of the first part, Daniel, entered into a dissolution of marriage while having engaged in documented marital infidelity, any assets contributed to the marital estate by the party of the second part, Eleanor, including intellectual contributions, strategic contributions, or financial contributions documented through third-party records, were subject to reversion to the contributing party plus interest at the prevailing rate. In other words, if Daniel cheated, the contract reversed. The intellectual contributions, the strategic contributions, the financial contributions, the binder on the kitchen table, Sunday morning, the coffee getting cold, the 3 acquisitions, the restructured risk model, the roadmap that had doubled Ashworth Capital's revenue in 3 years, all documented, all time-stamped, all attributable through Charlotte Park's meticulous preparation to Eleanor Voss, plus interest at the prevailing rate over 7 years. Daniel's attorney, Gerald Howe, had never read page 47 carefully. Why would he? In his experience, prenuptial addenda were protective documents for the wealthy party. He had drafted them for wealthy clients for 26 years, and not once had a provision turned in the other direction. He had not imagined that Eleanor's attorney, 6 weeks before her wedding, had inserted a mirror clause. A clause that said, if you choose this woman and then betray her, everything she built for you comes home. Charlotte Park had not told Gerald Howe about the clause. She was not required to. Discovery would handle that in its own time, in the appropriate setting. Charlotte Park had, however, very quietly over the preceding 6 weeks, assembled documentation of 3 things. 1. Eleanor's intellectual and strategic contributions to Ashworth Capital, sourced from internal firm communications, board minutes, and the testimony of 2 former Ashworth board members who had, it turned out, remembered quite clearly where certain ideas had come from. 2. Daniel's documented infidelity, sourced from digital records, financial transactions, and 1 piece of evidence that was so straightforward it barely required commentary, a hotel reservation in Simone's name, paid from a corporate card registered to Ashworth Capital's entertainment account, dated 11 months before Christmas Eve. 3. A financial valuation of Eleanor's contributions to the marital estate, prepared by an independent forensic accountant, which arrived at a number that had made Charlotte Park smile in a way her paralegal had described afterward as kind of scary. Everything was prepared. Everything was documented. Everything was ready. And Daniel Ashworth, who had spent the preceding 10 weeks managing his image in the press and attending charity events with Simone and telling his board that the divorce was amicable, had no idea. The courtroom on March 14th was the kind of room that had seen a great many important things. High ceilings, dark wood paneling that had absorbed decades of argument and verdict, and the specific weight of moments when people's lives changed direction. Tall windows along one wall, admitting a thin, clear light that fell across the gallery in pale rectangular shapes, shifting slowly as the morning progressed. It was full. Not a media circus, this was family court and the proceedings were formally private, but full in the sense that everyone who considered themselves relevant to the Ashworth family had found a reason to be present. Daniel's mother, Margaret, sat in the gallery in a charcoal coat, with her chin at its customary angle of authority. 3 members of the Ashworth board sat 2 rows behind her. Daniel's cousin Rachel sat near the back, very straight, her hands in her lap. Daniel Ashworth sat at the plaintiff's table with Gerald Howe, both of them in dark suits, both of them projecting the particular calm of men who have done their calculations and found the numbers satisfying. Eleanor came in 3 minutes before the session began. She wore a pale gray dress, simple, precise, the kind of clothing that communicates nothing except that the person wearing it decided exactly what they wanted to say. Her hair was neat. Her posture was the posture of a woman who had not slept easily in 11 weeks, but who had decided, with full deliberation, this morning she would be still. She carried Clara. Not because she needed to. Clara could have stayed with Diane, who had offered, but Eleanor had made a considered decision. She would not leave her daughter outside of this room. She was not making a statement. She was simply done pretending that the central fact of this situation was anything other than what it was. She had had a child. The child was here. The child was the reason any of this mattered. She settled Clara against her chest in the soft carrier and sat down beside Charlotte Park. Across the room, she felt rather than saw Daniel look at her, and then look away. The Honorable Judge Patricia Osai had presided over family court for 19 years. She was a compact, precise woman with reading glasses she wore low on her nose and a manner that reminded courthouse regulars of a surgeon, thorough, unhurried, and entirely unmoved by theater. She had seen enough wealthy divorces to have developed a specific and highly calibrated immunity to the performances that accompanied them. She had, however, read Charlotte Park's pre-hearing documentation the previous evening. She had read it carefully. She had read it twice. And when she entered the courtroom that morning and took her seat, the look she directed briefly, just the flash of a professional assessment toward the table where Eleanor sat, was not quite neutral. It was close, but not quite. Gerald Howe opened with the efficiency of a man who has done this many times and considers it largely procedural. He outlined the terms of the proposed settlement with the smooth, practiced fluency of someone presenting a reasonable and generous offer, and he spoke for 11 minutes without saying anything that a reasonable person would have disagreed with. When he was finished, he sat down with the composure of a man who believes the paperwork is complete. Judge Osai looked across to Charlotte Park. "Counselor?" Charlotte stood. She was younger than Gerald Howe by 15 years. She was also, in Eleanor's experience of her, complete without vanity about being underestimated, because she understood that underestimation was an advantage she did not need to request. She said, "Your Honor, we'd like to begin with Exhibit A." Exhibit A was the prenuptial agreement. Gerald Howe nodded at his paralegal with the faint smile of a man watching someone walk confidently towards a wall. The prenuptial was his ground. He had read it. He had reviewed it. He had spent 20 minutes on it 2 days before just to be certain. Charlotte placed the document on the projector. She turned to page 47. Exhibit A. She said, "I'd like to draw the court's attention to the addendum, specifically Section 7, Paragraph C." There was a pause. In that pause, I watched Gerald Howe. I watched his eyes move to the screen. I watched him move to the document in his own hands. I watched him read, actually read, perhaps for the first time, Paragraph C. I watched his face. It did not dramatically fall. He was a professional. But there was a specific, unmistakable tightening around the eyes, the micro-expression of a man encountering a wall he did not know was there. Daniel, beside him, leaned over and said something in a low voice. Gerald put his hand briefly on Daniel's arm, a restraining gesture, a weight gesture. He was already calculating. Charlotte walked the court through the addendum slowly and without theatrics. She read it aloud in its legal language, then translated it, sentence by sentence, into plain terms. The reversion right, the documented contributions, the conditions under which it triggered. Marital infidelity of the party of the first part, she read, documented through third-party evidence, triggers full reversion of all contributed assets as defined in Schedule B, with accrued interest at the prevailing commercial rate from the date of original contribution. She set down the document. Your Honor, we have documented evidence of infidelity dating to 11 months prior to the date of separation. We have forensic accounting documentation of Mrs. Ashworth's contributions to the marital estate, specifically to Ashworth Capital, over a 7-year period. And we have a financial valuation of those contributions, which has been submitted to the court as Exhibit C. Judge Osei looked at the exhibit. She read a figure. She wrote a note. She looked up. Counselor Howe, she said, would your client like to request a recess? The recess lasted 40 minutes. Eleanor sat in a small anteroom beside the courtroom with Charlotte and Clara and a cup of tea she did not particularly want. She could hear, through the closed door, the muffled tenor of heated conversation from somewhere down the corridor. Gerald Howe's voice, tightly controlled, and beneath it, the lower register of Daniel's, which she recognized as the voice he used when he was genuinely, undefensibly cornered. She had heard that voice perhaps 3 times in 7 years of marriage. She drank her tea. She looked at her daughter, asleep against her chest, with the absolute, trusting abandon of the very young. It's going to be fine, she said quietly. Not to Charlotte, to Clara. Whatever happens in there, it's going to be fine. When the session reconvened, Gerald Howe requested a continuance to allow his client time to review the new documentation fully. Judge Osei granted it, 3 weeks, but noted for the record that the court had reviewed Charlotte Park's submissions and found them substantive and prima facie valid. It was a small phrase, a procedural phrase, the kind of thing that appears in court records and means almost nothing to the general public. To Daniel Ashworth, who had grown up in a family where the relationship between money and control was as natural as breathing, it meant everything. Prima facie valid. The court found it valid. All of it. Eleanor stood to leave. She was calm, the kind of calm that is not the absence of feeling, but the mastery of it. She adjusted Clara in the carrier. She picked up her bag. She did not look at Daniel. But as she walked past the gallery, past Margaret in her charcoal coat, past the board members with their careful expressions, past Rachel, who had her hand pressed to her mouth, she felt something that she would describe afterward to Diane over tea as a rival. Not victory, not triumph, not revenge, a rival. The feeling of having come at last to the place you were always going to end up, the place that had been waiting for you while you were busy surviving everything that tried to prevent you from reaching it. She walked out through the tall courtroom doors into the clear March light with her daughter against her chest. Behind her, she heard Daniel say her name. One word, just her name. Eleanor. She did not stop. She did not go back into that courtroom, not for the 3-week continuation, not for the subsequent session which Charlotte Park attended on her behalf, not for the negotiation that followed, the very different, very much quieter negotiation that Gerald Howe initiated the morning after the recess, which Charlotte described to Eleanor on the phone, with the measured satisfaction of someone who had been waiting a long time to say what she was about to say. They've revised the offer considerably, Charlotte said. How considerably? Considerably enough that you could spend the rest of your life never thinking about Ashworth Capital again and be entirely comfortable, and then some. A pause. And the Connecticut house? Is no longer being offered as a concession, it's being returned as an asset. Eleanor sat in the rocking chair in the corner of the guest room, now converted, with Diane's cheerful help, into a nursery of sorts, with a second-hand crib and a yellow mobile and a line of small cloth animals along the windowsill. And she held Clara, and she breathed. Tell them yes, she said quietly, not to Charlotte, to Clara. Whatever happens in there, it's going to be fine. When the session reconvened, Gerald Howe requested a continuance to allow his client time to review the new documentation fully. Judge Osei granted it, 3 weeks, but noted for the record that the court had reviewed Charlotte Park's submissions and found them substantive and prima facie valid. It was a small phrase, a procedural phrase, the kind of thing that appears in court records and means almost nothing to the general public. To Daniel Ashworth, who had grown up in a family where the relationship between money and control was as natural as breathing, it meant everything. Prima facie valid. The court found it valid. All of it.
Eleanor, Charlotte's voice contained something soft and complicated. You know you could push further. The reversion clause gives you standing to pursue considerably more than what they're offering. I know. You'd probably win. I know that too. A long pause. But, Charlotte said. Eleanor looked at her daughter, at the curve of Clara's perfect ear, the sleeping weight of her, the small miracle of her breath. But I'm not interested in winning, she said quietly. I'm interested in being done. The settlement was signed on the 31st of March. Eleanor Voss in her own name on all the documents, walked out of Charlotte Park's office on a Tuesday afternoon in late spring with a life that was entirely, unambiguously, structurally her own. She was 33 years old. She had a daughter who was learning to notice the world, who tracked light with wondering eyes and gripped Eleanor's finger with a force that was, given her size, quite astounding. She had Voss Financial Partners, which had continued to grow quietly and competently during the preceding months, and which now, under Eleanor's full and undivided attention, was beginning to attract notice from the kind of institutional investors who pay attention to track records rather than surnames. She had the Connecticut house, which she drove to on a Friday afternoon in April for the first time since her mother had helped her hang curtains in the bedroom window. She walked through every room with Clara on her hip, slowly, relearning the dimensions of it. The kitchen with its wide windows, the back garden where something, snowdrops or early crocuses, was already pushing up through the cold ground. She stood at those kitchen windows for a long time. She thought about her mother, the woman who had sewn wedding gowns in the back of a house in Vermont for 30 years and never complained. She thought about what her mother had taught her, without ever explicitly teaching it, that love is not diminished by work, that work is not diminished by love, that a woman who knows the value of her own hands is never truly without a foundation. She thought about the Sunday morning and the binder and the coffee going cold, and how that morning had been, in some way she was only now able to see clearly, the truest portrait of who she was, a woman who noticed a problem and solved it, without fanfare, without seeking credit, out of a love that was real, even if its object turned out to be insufficient. She did not regret the love. She had loved Daniel Ashworth with her full intelligence and her full heart, and that was not something to be ashamed of. The fact that he had not known what to do with a love like that, the fact that he had eventually chosen to trade the real thing for a version that required less of him, that was his failure, not hers. She was done carrying it. Diane came for dinner that first night at the Connecticut house. They cooked together in the kitchen, a simple meal, pasta and salad, and a bottle of wine that Eleanor had been saving since before she got pregnant, and they talked the way old friends talk, without shape, following whatever thread felt true, circling back to things that mattered. At some point, Diane said, "What are you going to do next?" Eleanor was cutting bread at the kitchen island. She considered the question. "I'm going to raise my daughter," she said, "and build a company, and sleep more than 4 hours a night, in roughly that order." Diane laughed. "And Daniel?" A pause. Eleanor set down the bread knife. She looked through the kitchen window at the April evening outside, the garden darkening, the early stars just beginning, the the snowdrops she had noticed earlier, now white and indistinct in the dusk. "Daniel," she said slowly, "will be fine. He has money, and he has his mother, and he has the story he's been telling himself about who he is. That's enough for a certain kind of person." "And you? What's your story?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Clara, in her bouncer on the kitchen floor, made a small, decisive sound, not unhappy, just present, just here, just insisting, as she always did, on being noticed. Eleanor looked at her daughter. "My story," she said, "is just beginning." Eleanor Voss had been told in 100 small ways across 7 years that her value was in her usefulness, that her strength was most appreciated when it was invisible, that the most generous thing a capable woman can do is make a less capable man feel like the most capable person in the room. She had given that generosity freely, out of love, and without resentment. And when it was returned to her, wrapped in a manila envelope on Christmas Eve in a house decorated with lights that were still blinking, red and gold and white, she had done what she had always done. She had been still. She had been clear. She had thought carefully and moved precisely and built something in the quiet that no one thought to look for. Not for revenge, not to win, but because she understood, with the bone-deep, unshakable knowledge of a woman who had always known her own worth, even in the years when she had been willing to let someone else set the price, that there is a difference between being underestimated and being unknown. Daniel Ashworth had underestimated her for 7 years. He had never, for a single moment, known her. And that, more than the prenuptial addendum, more than the holding company, more than the numbers in the forensic accountant's report that made a courtroom go briefly, measurably quiet, that was the thing that had always, quietly, been her greatest advantage. On a Tuesday morning in May, Eleanor Voss sat at the desk in the Connecticut house's small study, with Clara asleep in the bassinet beside her, and the window open to the sound of birds and a light breeze carrying the smell of new grass, and she opened her laptop and began to work. The same way she had always. Carefully, precisely, without fanfare. For herself this time, and for the small, fierce, perfectly sleeping person beside her, who would one day grow up and perhaps ask, "Mom, how did you do it?" And Eleanor would look at her and say, "I knew what I was worth, and I never let anyone else set the price."